Late one night, Mr. Brown wandered into a hidden, forgotten shop and laid eyes on a peculiar doll, a doll with lifelike eyes that seemed to follow him, watching his every move. Compelled by an urge he couldn't explain, he took it home, thinking it might ease his lonely nights. But strange things began almost immediately. Shadows moved when he was alone. Mysterious whispers echoed through the empty rooms, and every time he tried to rid himself of the doll, it came back, each time with a smile more sinister than before. Why wouldn't it leave? What terrible secrets was this doll hiding? Was it merely a toy? Or something far darker? Before discovering the chilling truth, subscribe to the channel and prepare for a story you won't forget. In the heart of a small, quiet town, nestled among other houses with well-kept gardens, stood a modest home belonging to Mr. Brown. Unlike the vibrant homes filled with laughter and chatter, Mr. Brown's house seemed to wear a cloak of solitude. Its once bright paint had faded, and the front yard, while neat, lacked the colorful flowers that decorated the gardens of his neighbors. Mr. Brown was a man in his 50s, with thinning hair and deep-set eyes that often gazed longingly out of the window, as if searching for something just beyond his reach. He worked as a clerk in a nearby office, where he spent his days surrounded by paperwork and the busy hum of conversations that felt foreign to him. Despite his hard work, he had very few friends and often felt invisible among his coworkers. Each day blended into the next, filled with the same routine. Waking up early, taking the bus to work, and returning home to the silence of his empty house. The only place where Mr. Brown found some joy was in his garden. He loved tending to the flowers that bloomed in a riot of colors during the summer months: red roses, bluebells, and yellow daisies. In the evenings, he would sit on a worn wooden bench in the garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of blossoms, hoping for a moment of peace. But as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, a familiar loneliness crept in, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Despite his love for his garden, there was always a nagging emptiness in Mr. Brown's heart. He often thought about how nice it would be to have someone to share his life with, someone who could fill the silence that echoed through his home. Yet, he had grown accustomed to solitude and convinced himself that it was better that way. One particularly hot summer day, Mr. Brown felt an unusual urge to escape his routine. The air was thick and heavy, and he decided to walk home instead of taking the bus. As he strolled through the sun-drenched streets, he savored the warmth on his skin, feeling as if the sun might melt away his loneliness. While walking, he came upon a small antique shop nestled between larger, more modern stores. The shop looked old and slightly neglected, its windows dusty and filled with forgotten treasures. Mr. Brown felt a spark of curiosity and decided to step inside, drawn by an unseen force. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, filled with the smell of aged wood and dust. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with old books, tarnished trinkets, and faded photographs. Mr. Brown wandered through the narrow aisles, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was a world away from his lonely existence. A world filled with stories, memories, and perhaps something extraordinary. As he explored, his gaze fell upon an old doll sitting on a high shelf. The doll had a sad, wrinkled face, dressed in black clothes that seemed to swallow its frail figure. Its white hair was unkempt, and its eyes seemed to gaze directly at him, holding a mystery that tugged at his heartstrings. For a moment, Mr. Brown felt a strange connection to the doll, as if it too understood loneliness. Perhaps it is lonely, just like me, he thought. With a mixture of dread and intrigue, he approached the shelf. The air grew thick with anticipation, and the faint sound of a clock ticking in the background echoed ominously in the silence. What was it about this doll that captured his attention? And why did he feel an overwhelming urge to take it home? As he stood there, uncertainty began to swirl around him like a fog, enveloping his thoughts. Would this doll change his life? Or would it plunge him deeper into the shadows of his solitude? With a deep breath, Mr. Brown made a decision that would set the course for his future. Little did he know that the choice he was about to make would unravel a series of events that would challenge his understanding of reality, love, and fear itself. As Mr. Brown approached the doll, he felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The shop was quiet, with only the sound of his footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. The closer he got to the shelf, the more he felt the pull of the doll, as if it was calling out to him. He reached up and carefully picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was old and slightly dusty, but there was something oddly captivating about it. "What a strange little thing," he murmured, inspecting its sad face. The doll's expression seemed to reflect his own feelings of loneliness and longing. For reasons he couldn't quite understand, he felt compelled to take it home. Maybe it could be his companion, a silent friend to share his evenings with. £3, said the shopkeeper, interrupting his thoughts. The man had appeared beside him, watching with a knowing smile. Mr. Brown fumbled for his wallet, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know why he was willing to spend so much on an old doll, but the urge was too strong to resist. With a shaky hand, he handed over the money. "Thank you," the shopkeeper said, his smile broadening as he wrapped the doll in brown paper. Mr. Brown took the package, feeling a thrill of anticipation. It was a small act, but it felt monumental, a step toward breaking the cycle of solitude that had gripped his life for so long. Once outside, Mr. Brown clutched the doll tightly as he walked home. The sun blazed overhead, but he hardly noticed. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of the doll. Would it really make him feel less alone? Could it bring a spark of joy into his quiet life? As he approached his house, he felt a strange sense of hope bubbling up within him. However, that hope quickly turned to unease as he entered his home. The familiar silence wrapped around him like a heavy fog. He placed the doll on the table, observing its somber expression. Was it just a doll, or was there something more to it? A chill ran down his spine as he recalled how its eyes seemed to follow him, as if it were alive. Mr. Brown tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. After a simple dinner of bread and butter, he settled down on the couch, determined to ignore the growing anxiety in his chest. He flicked on the television, the noise filling the silence, but he found it hard to concentrate. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the doll. It was still on the table, its presence lingering in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a piece of old porcelain. Was he losing his mind? Or could it be that the doll held some kind of power? The question haunted him as he drifted off to sleep, leaving the doll alone in the dimly lit room. In the early hours of the morning, Mr. Brown was jolted awake by a noise. It sounded like something had fallen. Confused and slightly frightened, he sat up in bed, his heart racing. The house was dark, but he could make out the outline of the doll sitting on the table. "What's happening?" he whispered to himself, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. Had he imagined the noise? His eyes narrowed, trying to see through the shadows. And then, to his astonishment, he noticed that the doll had moved. It was no longer facing the wall, but was now turned toward him, a faint smile etched across its face. His breath caught in his throat. "No, it can't be," he thought. He quickly shook his head, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps he had left it in that position before going to bed, or was it just the darkness playing tricks on him? Feeling compelled to confront his fear, he got out of bed and crept toward the doll. The room was silent, except for the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He reached out, a trembling hand, and touched the doll's cold porcelain face. It felt eerily lifelike, as if it was watching him, judging him. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the other room, making Mr. Brown jump back. Adrenaline surged through him as he hurried to investigate. As he entered the kitchen, he was met with chaos. Cups and plates lay shattered on the floor. "What's going on?" he gasped, his mind racing. Had someone broken in? But the door was locked, and there was no sign of a struggle. He turned back to the living room, and there it was, the doll, now sitting on the kitchen table, smiling widely. Mr. Brown felt a shiver of terror wash over him. How could this be? He hadn't carried it into the kitchen, he had left it in the other room. The doll was somehow moving on its own. Panic surged through him, and he realized that he needed to get rid of it. It wasn't just a harmless toy, it was a source of chaos and fear. "I can't keep you," he said, trembling as he took the doll in his arms. "I'll bury you in the garden." As he stormed outside, the moonlight cast eerie shadows around him. The world felt different now, as if something sinister was lurking just out of sight. He dug a small hole in the garden, driven by desperation. "This will end tonight," he muttered, Burying the doll deep in the ground, he covered it with soil, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. But as he walked back into his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The encounter with the doll had awakened something dark and mysterious within his life. What would happen next? Would the doll return? A storm of questions whirled in his mind, leaving him feeling more unsettled than ever before. The next morning, Mr. Brown woke up feeling exhausted, as if the weight of the doll still hung around his neck. He could hardly remember falling asleep, but one thing was clear. He hadn't dreamt about the doll, which gave him a fleeting sense of relief. As he sat up in bed, he felt determined to forget the strange events of the night before. Perhaps burying the doll had put an end to the bizarre occurrences. After a quick breakfast, he stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sun was shining and the birds were chirping, creating a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling in his mind. He was late for work, but a strange sense of dread clung to him as he hurried to the bus stop. The ride to the office was uneventful. People chatted, the bus jostled along the road, and for the first time in days, Mr. Brown felt a flicker of normalcy returning to his life. He focused on the conversations around him, trying to drown out his lingering worries. But the moment he sat down at his desk, an unsettling thought crossed his mind. What if the doll was still in his garden, watching him? Trying to shake off the feeling, he dove into his work. As the hours passed, however, an eerie sense of unease continued to follow him. The office felt unusually quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. He noticed his colleagues casting strange glances in his direction, whispering and then falling silent when he looked their way. At lunch, Mr. Brown decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping it would clear his mind. As he sat on a bench in a nearby park, he felt a slight breeze rustle through the trees, but it did little to ease his anxiety. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over him, blocking out the sun. He looked up to see the shopkeeper from the antique store standing there, his expression serious. "Hello, Mr. Brown," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that doll." Mr. Brown's heart raced. "What do you mean?" he stammered, feeling a chill creep up his spine. "I've had some customers come back to me with stories about that doll," the shopkeeper said, his eyes darting around as if he feared someone might be listening. "They say it has a life of its own. Strange things happen when it's around." "What are you talking about?" Mr. Brown replied, trying to mask his fear with anger. "It's just a doll." "Just a doll." The shopkeeper leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I don't believe that. You should be careful. Once it's in your life, it's hard to get rid of." Mr. Brown shook his head, dismissing the man's warning. "I buried it," he insisted. "It's gone." The shopkeeper's face grew serious. "That's what they all say, until it finds a way back." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mr. Brown in a state of confusion and growing fear. Shaking off the encounter, Mr. Brown returned to the office, but his mind was now a storm of anxiety. He couldn't concentrate on his work. The thoughts of the doll plagued him, and he started to wonder if there was some truth to what the shopkeeper had said. Was it really gone? After a long, tiring day, Mr. Brown took the bus home, his heart pounding with every passing block. The air felt thick with tension, and the chatter of the other passengers sounded distant and muffled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him at home. When he finally arrived, he hesitated at the door, sensing an unsettling energy in the air. "It's just my imagination," he whispered to himself, pushing the door open. The familiar quiet of his home greeted him, but there was something different, something heavy in the atmosphere. He stepped inside and immediately noticed that the kitchen window was wide open, letting in a cool breeze. The doll was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through him. Had he really buried it, or had it somehow returned? His heart raced as he moved cautiously to the garden. He knelt down, digging through the soil with trembling hands. The hole was empty. "No, no, no," he muttered, feeling sick to his stomach. It wasn't possible. He had buried it deep. There was no way it could have escaped. As he stood up, he noticed something glinting in the evening light. It was the doll, sitting on the garden table, grinning up at him with an unsettling smile. The sight sent a shock of fear through him. "How did you get here?" he cried out, stumbling back in disbelief. The doll's eyes seemed to glimmer with mischief, as if it enjoyed his panic. Rage mixed with terror as he grabbed the doll and threw it against the ground. "Leave me alone," he yelled, his voice echoing in the stillness of the evening. To his horror, the doll merely bounced back, its smile unchanged. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted, feeling utterly defeated. It was as if the doll was mocking him, its expression forever frozen in that eerie grin. Desperate, Mr. Brown picked it up again and carried it inside, determined to lock it away for good. He shoved it into a closet, slamming the door shut behind him. He felt a momentary sense of relief, but knew he couldn't escape the creeping dread that had taken over his life. That night, he sat awake in bed, listening for any sounds. The house was silent, but every creak and groan sent shivers down his spine. Finally, fatigue overtook him, and he drifted off to sleep, hoping to find some peace. But in the dead of night, a loud crash jolted him awake. Heart pounding, he scrambled out of bed, rushing to the closet where he had locked away the doll. To his horror, the door stood ajar, swinging slightly as if someone had just come out. "No," he whispered, dread filling his chest. "It can't be." He peeked inside and found the doll sitting right at the front, smiling wider than ever before. Fear gripped him as he realized the truth. The doll was not just a mere object, it was a dark presence in his life. What would it do next? The night felt heavy with anticipation, and Mr. Brown knew he was on the brink of something terrifying. The unraveling had begun, and there was no turning back now. As the sun rose the next day, Mr. Brown felt a heavy dread settle over him. He was sure the doll was watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true nature. The bizarre events of the previous nights weighed heavily on his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control. Determined to regain some sense of normalcy, he left the house early, hoping that a busy day at the office would distract him. The bus ride was tense, with every bump and jolt making him jump. Each time he caught a glimpse of the people around him, their faces seemed to twist into eerie expressions, like the doll's smile. He tried to dismiss these thoughts, reminding himself that he was being irrational. But deep down, he knew something was very wrong. At work, his colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor. They exchanged worried glances, but Mr. Brown was too preoccupied to care. He buried himself in paperwork, trying to focus on numbers and reports rather than the creeping anxiety that clutched at him. But with every tick of the clock, the feeling of impending doom grew stronger. As lunchtime approached, Mr. Brown's stomach churned. He could hardly eat, and instead, he decided to take a walk outside, hoping fresh air would clear his mind. He wandered through the nearby park, but the moment he stepped onto the path, he felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was as if the world around him had faded, leaving only the doll's presence looming over him. Suddenly, he spotted a group of children playing nearby, their laughter ringing through the air. One little girl caught his eye. She was holding a similar old doll, her face glowing with joy as she played. Mr. Brown felt a pang of longing mixed with fear. What if that doll is just like mine? He thought, his heart racing. He turned away, trying to ignore the memories of his own doll. But as he walked back toward the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. The sensation of eyes on him grew stronger, and he quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. Back at his desk, he struggled to concentrate. His mind kept drifting to the doll, and he could swear he heard whispers whenever he was alone. The tension was unbearable. By the end of the day, he was desperate to escape the office. As he left work, the shadows stretched long across the street. The bus ride home felt like a nightmare, each stop dragging on as if the universe was mocking his fears. When he finally arrived home, he was greeted by an uncomfortable silence. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy. He hesitated at the door, wondering if he should just leave the doll outside forever. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He had to confront it. Mustering all his courage, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The moment he entered, he felt the temperature drop, as if someone had turned off the heat. His heart raced as he approached the closet where he had locked the doll away. The door was slightly ajar, just like the night before. He took a deep breath and flung the door open, revealing the doll sitting exactly where he had left it, smiling, its eyes glimmering in the dim light. "No!" Brown shouted, panic surging through him. He reached for the doll, determined to end this madness once and for all. As he grabbed it, a wave of cold energy washed over him, making him shudder. The doll felt alive, pulsing with a strange power that filled the room. "Leave me alone," he yelled, throwing it back into the closet. He slammed the door shut, locking it tightly. For a moment, he felt a sense of victory, but that feeling quickly faded as he heard a soft knock coming from the other side of the door. "Let me out," a voice whispered. It was low and raspy, and Mr. Brown's heart sank. He backed away, fear coursing through him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The doll was speaking. He rushed to the living room, desperately trying to distance himself from the horror lurking behind the closet door. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. "Let me out! I'm lonely," the voice cried, a hint of desperation creeping into its tone. Mr. Brown's mind raced. What kind of power did this doll have? Was it really just a toy, or was it something far more sinister? In a panic, he grabbed his phone and dialed the shopkeeper's number, his hands trembling as he waited for the man to pick up. When the shopkeeper finally answered, Mr. Brown could hardly form words. "The doll, it's talking to me," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Didn't I warn you?" The shopkeeper replied, his tone grave. "That doll is cursed. It feeds off loneliness and despair. You need to get rid of it before it takes control of you." "But how?" Mr. Brown asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I thought I could bury it, burn it. Nothing works." "Listen to me," the shopkeeper urged. "You need to confront it, show it that you're not afraid. Otherwise, it will only grow stronger." Mr. Brown felt a rush of fear mixed with anger. How could he confront something that terrified him? But deep down he knew he had no choice. The doll was becoming a part of him, feeding on his fears and insecurities. He hung up the phone, determination flickering in his heart. "I won't let you control me," he shouted, turning back toward the closet. With renewed courage he approached the door, knowing that this was the moment he had to face his fears. He took a deep breath, opened the closet, and pulled the doll out, holding it up to his face. "I'm not lonely," he declared, his voice steady. "You don't scare me." But the doll only smiled wider, its eyes gleaming with a dark light. The air around him crackled with energy, and suddenly, Mr. Brown felt a rush of cold wind, knocking him off balance. The lights flickered, and shadows danced on the walls, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. "Let the games begin," the doll whispered, and Mr. Brown knew he was about to face a battle for his very soul. The conflict had begun, and he had to fight not just for himself, but for his sanity and his life. The air crackled with tension as Mr. Brown stood face to face with the doll, its eyes shimmering with a sinister glow. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that he was caught in a battle that would determine his fate. Panic surged through him, but alongside it, a fierce determination began to ignite. He couldn't allow this doll to control him any longer. "Get out of my life," he shouted, clutching the doll tightly, his fingers trembling. The doll only smiled wider, a step as if mocking his fear. A chilling laughter echoed in the room, and Mr. Brown's heart raced faster. The laughter was not just in his mind, it surrounded him, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. In a sudden surge of desperation, he tossed the doll onto the floor. "I'll end this," he yelled, feeling a rush of adrenaline. He grabbed a nearby heavy book from the shelf and raised it high above his head, ready to smash the doll into pieces. But just as he was about to strike, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the room into shadows. "Don't do it, Mr. Brown," the doll whispered, its voice softer now but filled with an unsettling calm. "You know I can't be destroyed that easily. You'll only make me stronger." Mr. Brown hesitated, his resolve wavering. The doll's words struck a chord of fear deep within him. He lowered the book slightly, taking a step back as uncertainty crept into his mind. How could a simple doll have such power over him? He needed a plan, something beyond brute force. Suddenly, an idea flashed through his mind. He remembered the shopkeeper's warning. The doll fed on loneliness. Perhaps if he could confront the source of his own isolation, he could weaken its grip. Gathering his courage, Mr. Brown took a deep breath and spoke with a steady voice. "I'm not lonely anymore," he declared. "I have my garden, my job, and my dreams. I may have been alone before, but I refuse to let you define me." The doll's smile faltered for just a moment, its eyes narrowing as if assessing the truth of his words. Mr. Brown felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. He would not let this cursed doll manipulate his feelings any longer. Driven by a sudden burst of determination, he dashed outside into his garden, leaving the doll behind. The sun was setting, casting warm golden rays over the flowers he had nurtured for years. He knelt down among the blooms, breathing in their sweet scent, feeling their vibrant colors wrap around him like a comforting blanket. "This is where I belong," he whispered to himself, the shadows of despair starting to lift. "I will fight back." As he tended to the flowers, Mr. Brown's thoughts began to clear. He realized that the doll had thrived on his loneliness and sadness, but out here, surrounded by life and beauty, he felt empowered. He picked a handful of vibrant red and blue flowers, feeling their life force surge through him. With renewed strength, he marched back inside. But as he opened the door, the darkness within his home hit him like a cold wave. The doll was waiting for him, perched on the table, its smile now twisted and menacing. "You think flowers can save you?" it taunted, its voice echoing through the room. "You will always be alone." Ignoring its words, Mr. Brown held out the flowers, his heart pounding with every beat. "These flowers represent my life, my joy," he shouted, determination shining in his eyes. "You can't take that away from me." The doll's expression shifted, a flicker of anger flashing across its face. The room began to tremble as if the very walls were reacting to their confrontation. A whirlwind of wind swirled around Mr. Brown, but he stood firm, refusing to back down. "Leave me alone," he shouted, thrusting the flowers closer to the doll. "You can't control me anymore." As he held the flowers aloft, a brilliant light burst from them, illuminating the darkness that had enveloped the room. The doll recoiled, its smile twisting into a snarl, and Mr. Brown felt a rush of power surge through him. "I see you for what you are," he yelled. "You are not my friend, you are a parasite feeding on my fears." In that moment, he realized he didn't just want to rid himself of the doll, he wanted to reclaim his life. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he hurled the flowers at the doll. They exploded in a burst of vibrant color, the petals scattering like confetti in the wind. The doll screeched, its form wavering as if the very essence of its being was unraveling. The shadows in the room twisted and convulsed, battling against the light. Mr. Brown felt the power of the flowers bolstering him, and he knew this was his chance. "Now," he cried, lunging forward. He snatched the doll from the table, feeling its cold surface against his palm. "I won't let you control me anymore." With a fierce roar, he opened the front door and rushed outside, the last rays of sunlight illuminating his path. He could feel the doll struggling in his grasp, its voice pleading and angry. "You can't do this. I am part of you," it shouted, but Mr. Brown pressed on. Reaching the center of his garden, he dug a hole with frantic energy, tossing the doll inside. He knew he had to bury it deep, away from his life forever. As he covered it with dirt, the winds howled around him, trying to pull him back, but he refused to yield. With the last shovelful of dirt, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The doll's cries grew faint as he pressed the soil down firmly, sealing it away. "You will never haunt me again," he declared, his heart pounding with triumph. But just as he stood back, breathless and shaken, he heard a faint whisper from beneath the earth. "You think you've won, but I'll always be here, waiting for you to feel lonely again." Mr. Brown shivered, the chilling reminder echoing in his mind. He turned away from the grave he had made, knowing that while he had taken a step toward freedom, the battle was far from over. The conflict was now more personal than ever. He had to confront his own demons and ensure that loneliness would never find him again. With determination in his heart, he vowed to embrace his life fully. He would nurture his garden, reach out to others, and cultivate connections that would keep the darkness at bay. As he walked back toward his house, he felt the weight of the world lift slightly from his shoulders. But he knew he had to remain vigilant. The sun set behind him, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. And for the first time in a long while, Mr. Brown felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it. This was only the beginning of his journey toward freedom, and he would not let the doll's whispers haunt him any longer. The days passed, and Mr. Brown's garden thrived, but so did the whispers of the doll in his mind. Even after burying it, he felt a lingering presence, a shadow that refused to fade. The sunlight could not chase away the growing fear that the doll was still watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. Each time he ventured into his garden, he could almost hear the echo of its laughter in the rustling leaves. One evening, as a storm rolled in, dark clouds looming overhead, the air grew thick with tension. Mr. Brown could feel the weight of dread settle in his stomach. Lightning flashed, illuminating his home, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the shadows. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, but doubt gnawed at him. Just as he was about to retreat into the safety of his house, a loud knock echoed through the air, startling him. The sound was sharp and urgent, demanding his attention. He hesitated, glancing at the door, a chill creeping down his spine. Who could be visiting at this hour? With cautious steps he approached the door, heart pounding. As he opened it, rain poured in, drenching him instantly. Standing on his doorstep was a figure cloaked in darkness, water dripping from the edges of their hood. The face was obscured but Mr. Brown could feel the weight of their gaze piercing through the shadows. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I've come to warn you," the figure replied, their voice low and raspy. "The doll is not gone. It seeks to reclaim you." A wave of panic surged through Mr. Brown. "But I buried it. I thought I was free." The figure stepped closer, their face still hidden. "You cannot escape its power so easily. It knows your weaknesses. It waits for you to falter." The rain intensified, creating a deafening sound as it beat against the ground. "Why should I believe you?" Mr. Brown demanded, his pulse racing. "How do I know you're not a trick, too?" As if in response to his doubt, the air around him grew colder, and the wind howled, carrying a familiar, sinister laughter. Mr. Brown felt his heart drop as he recognized the sound, the doll's laughter. "It knows you're afraid," the figure continued, their voice urgent. "It feeds on fear. You must confront it again, this time without holding back." Before Mr. Brown could respond, the figure turned to leave, their silhouette disappearing into the storm. He stood frozen, drenched and trembling, as the laughter echoed louder in his ears. With a sudden surge of determination, he knew he had to face the doll one last time. He could not let it control him any longer. He sprinted back to the garden, the rain pounding against him, each drop igniting a fierce urgency. Reaching the spot where he had buried the doll, he felt his heart race. The earth was still damp from the rain, and he began to dig furiously, desperation driving him forward. As he unearthed the doll, it was covered in mud, its once vibrant colors dulled. But as he pulled it from the ground, the laughter erupted around him, chilling his bones. "Did you really think you could escape me?" the doll taunted, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. "You're still lonely, Mr. Brown. You'll always be lonely." Fear surged through him, but he fought to remain steady. "I'm not alone. I have my garden, my life," he shouted, gripping the doll tightly. "I refuse to let you control me." The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the night sky, and with it came a jolt of realization. He understood that the doll was a reflection of his own insecurities. It was not just an object. It was a manifestation of his deepest fears, his loneliness, his despair. With renewed strength, he lifted the doll high above his head. "I will not be defined by you," he screamed, his voice rising above the thunder. But just as he was about to throw it away, the doll's expression shifted, and a wave of darkness engulfed him. Shadows twisted around him, forming into figures of people he had lost, friends, family, even fleeting acquaintances, each one whispering his failures, his regrets. "You're alone, Mr. Brown. You always have been," they chorused, their voices merging into a haunting melody. "No," he shouted, shaking his head. "You're not real. You are just my fears." Summoning every ounce of courage, he focused on the love he had for his garden, the beauty around him, and the connections he had begun to forge. With a fierce cry, he hurled the doll into the depths of his garden, where he had created a small fire pit. As the doll landed among the twigs and dried leaves, he quickly struck a match, flames leaping to life and consuming the doll. The laughter turned to screams, filling the air with chaos. The figures of lost friends began to dissipate, their whispers fading into the crackling of the fire. "I am not afraid of you anymore." Mr. Brown yelled, watching as the flames danced higher, casting a warm glow in the darkness. "You cannot haunt me. I choose to live." With that, the fire surged, engulfing the doll in a brilliant blaze. The heat washed over him, and as the last remnants of the doll turned to ash, a profound silence enveloped the garden. The storm began to clear, the clouds parting to reveal a glimmer of stars above. In that moment, Mr. Brown felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. The shadows that had clung to him were gone, and the oppressive weight of loneliness began to lift. He had faced his fears, confronted the source of his despair, and emerged victorious. But as he stared into the smoldering remains of the doll, a single thought lingered in his mind. Was this truly the end, or had he merely begun a new chapter in his battle against loneliness? He knew the answer would only come with time, but for now he felt alive, surrounded by the beauty of his garden, ready to embrace whatever came next. As the last flickers of flame died down, leaving behind a heap of glowing embers, Mr. Brown felt an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over him. The night was quiet, the storm had passed, and the stars shone brightly above, illuminating his garden with a soft, gentle glow. For the first time in a long while, he felt free from the haunting presence of the doll. But as he stood there, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Was it really over? Had he truly defeated the darkness that had followed him? He looked at the charred remains of the doll, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shape shift within the ashes, a shadow flickering at the edge of his vision. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light. He had to believe that this was the end of his torment. With cautious steps, he turned away from the remnants of the fire and walked back to his house. The air felt different, lighter, almost invigorating. As he entered, he noticed the familiar creaks of the floorboards and the comforting scent of his home. He realized how much he had missed this feeling, the warmth of familiarity that had once felt so distant. The next morning, Mr. Brown woke with the sun streaming through his window, casting golden rays across his room. He sat up slowly, remembering the events of the previous night. The fear that had gripped him seemed like a distant memory now. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with fresh air, and made his way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed the garden through the window. The flowers bloomed vibrantly, their colors more vivid than he remembered. Each petal seemed to whisper stories of resilience and beauty, reminding him of the joy that lay in nurturing life. He felt a rush of gratitude for the little things he had overlooked during his time of despair. After breakfast, Mr. Brown decided to spend the day tending to his garden. He grabbed his gardening tools and ventured outside, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As he worked, he noticed that the world around him felt more alive. Birds chirped cheerfully, and butterflies danced from flower to flower. He could hear the laughter of children playing nearby, a reminder that life continued in the world beyond his walls. While digging in the soil, he stumbled upon a small, rusted key. Curious, he wiped it clean and examined it closely. What could this open? He wondered, intrigued. He had never noticed it before. Perhaps it belonged to an old shed or a forgotten box. A sense of adventure sparked within him. This small discovery symbolized hope, a reminder that there were still mysteries to uncover in his life. Later that day, driven by curiosity, Mr. Brown decided to explore his neighborhood. He hadn't ventured far from home in years, and the thought excited him. As he walked through the streets, he noticed the small things he had taken for granted, the laughter of neighbors, the scents of fresh bread from the bakery, and the warmth of friendly greetings from passers-by. His heart swelled with a sense of belonging that he had long forgotten. With each interaction, he felt a little more connected, a little less lonely. It was as if the world was welcoming him back, inviting him to be a part of it once again. On his way home, Mr. Brown found himself drawn to the old shop where he had first encountered the doll. As he stepped inside, the familiar chime of the bell above the door echoed, and the shopkeeper looked up with a friendly smile. "Back for more treasures?" the man asked, his eyes sparkling with warmth. Mr. Brown chuckled, feeling lighter than ever. "Actually, I found something interesting," he replied, pulling out the rusted key from his pocket. "Do you know what this might belong to?" The shopkeeper examined the key closely, a look of surprise crossing his face. "Ah, yes. That key might open an old chest in the back room. It's been there for years, and no one has found the key. I'd be happy to show you." Intrigued, Mr. Brown followed the shopkeeper to the back of the store. As they reached the dusty old chest, his heart raced with anticipation. What could be inside? The shopkeeper unlocked it with the key, and as the lid creaked open, a cloud of dust filled the air. Inside lay an assortment of forgotten items, old letters, photographs, and trinkets that spoke of lives once lived. Mr. Brown picked up a faded photograph of a smiling couple and felt a pang of nostalgia. The stories hidden within these treasures felt like a bridge to the past, connecting him to the lives of others. As he sifted through the chest, he discovered a letter addressed to him, dated many years ago. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was from a long-lost friend who had moved away, expressing their fond memories of their time together and urging Mr. Brown to reach out to others. Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. It was as if his friend had known the loneliness he had faced. With each sentence, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The letter was a reminder that he was not as isolated as he once believed, that there were people who cared about him, even if they were far away. As he left the shop, Mr. Brown realized that the past could be a source of healing. The journey to rediscover himself was not just about defeating the darkness, but also about embracing the light that surrounded him. With a heart full of hope, he returned home, feeling lighter than he had in years. The doll was gone, but its lesson remained, a reminder that he had the power to shape his reality. No longer would he allow loneliness to define him. Instead, he would cultivate connections and nurture the love around him. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Brown became an active part of his community. He began to host garden parties, inviting neighbors and friends to join him. With each gathering, he forged new relationships, shared laughter, and rekindled old friendships. His garden flourished, both with flowers and connections, transforming into a sanctuary of joy. And although the memory of the doll lingered, it no longer held power over him. He understood that fear could only thrive in darkness, and by choosing to live in the light, he could banish it forever. The journey had not been easy, but it had shaped him into a stronger man. Mr. Brown learned that love, friendship, and connection were the true treasures of life, far more valuable than any doll. And as he tended to his garden, he smiled, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Brown settled into his new life with a sense of purpose and joy. The garden parties became a cherished tradition in the neighborhood, drawing laughter and warmth from all who attended. Each gathering was a celebration of connection, filled with stories, food, and the shared joy of friendship. But even as Mr. Brown reveled in his newfound happiness, a part of him remained alert, ever watchful for the shadows of the past. Though the doll had been destroyed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness might still linger somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. Every creak of his house, every whisper of the wind, sent a shiver down his spine, reminding him of the fear that once consumed him. One evening, after a particularly joyous gathering, Mr. Brown decided to take a late-night stroll through his garden. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silvery light across the flowers, their petals glistening like jewels. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, soothing his mind and soul. As he walked, he paused at the spot where the doll had once stood. Memories flooded back, the fear, the anger, and the ultimate triumph over that haunting presence. He could hardly believe how far he had come. Yet, as he stood there, a flicker of unease stirred within him. Was it truly over? Just then he noticed a glimmer in the corner of his eye. A small object was partially buried in the soil. Curiosity piqued, he knelt down and began to dig it out. With trembling fingers, he unearthed a small, weathered box, its surface covered in dust and dirt. The box was locked, and his heart raced at the thought of what secrets it might hold. Feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation, Mr. Brown hurried back inside, the box clutched tightly in his hands. He rummaged through his drawers, searching for something, anything that might open it. After a few moments of frantic searching, he found an old letter opener with a slender blade. With bated breath, he inserted it into the lock and turned it. The box creaked open, revealing its contents, a collection of old photographs, letters, and a journal. Mr. Brown flipped through the pages of the journal, his eyes widening with each entry. The journal belonged to the doll's original owner, a young girl who had lived in the house decades ago. The entries told stories of love, loss, and the girl's obsession with a strange magical doll that could grant wishes. As he read, he discovered dark secrets hidden within the words. The girl wrote of how the doll had twisted her wishes, turning her life into a nightmare, filled with jealousy and sorrow. She had become consumed by her desires, ultimately leading to a tragic ending. Mr. Brown's heart raced as he realized that the doll's powers were real, but they came at a terrible price. Each wish granted created a ripple effect, impacting not only the wisher but those around them. He felt a chill run down his spine as he understood that the connection between the doll and the darkness he had faced. But then, he noticed something alarming. The final entries in the journal hinted at a curse that would return to those who had disturbed the doll's resting place. A sense of dread washed over him. Had he truly escaped the darkness, or had he merely awakened something more sinister? Determined to uncover the truth, Mr. Brown delved deeper into the journal, tracing the girl's last days. The final entry was frantic and filled with fear. She warned that the curse would return if the box were ever opened, that it would seek out the next victim to fulfill its dark desires. His pulse quickened as he realized the implications. Had he unwittingly brought the darkness back into his life? With each word he read, he felt the weight of dread settle in his chest. Was his newfound happiness merely an illusion, a fleeting moment before the storm? The next day, Mr. Brown decided to confront his fears head-on. He gathered his friends and shared the findings from the journal. As he recounted the girl's story and the curse, the atmosphere shifted. Unease rippled through the group, and whispers filled the air as they debated what to do next. Some suggested they burn the journal and box to rid themselves of the potential threat once and for all. Others felt a deep connection to the girl's story and argued for a different approach, wanting to honor her memory and learn from her experiences. The tension in the room grew, with opinions clashing as fear took hold of everyone's hearts. In the midst of the chaos, Mr. Brown felt a sudden clarity. He realized that facing the darkness was not just about eliminating it, but understanding it. He proposed a plan. They would research the girl's story further, uncovering more about her life and the history of the doll. Together, they would confront the past and seek a way to break the curse once and for all. As they began their quest, a sense of purpose united them. Each member of the group brought their unique skills and perspectives, and together they delved into the past. They visited libraries, interviewed local historians, and even sought out psychics who claimed to have a connection to the supernatural. Days turned into weeks as they uncovered pieces of the puzzle. They learned about the history of the doll, the girl's tragic fate, and the toll that desire and obsession could take on one's life. With each revelation, Mr. Brown felt the shadows of fear recede, replaced by a sense of empowerment. They were not merely victims. They were a team, united against the darkness. Eventually, they uncovered a ritual that could potentially break the curse. It required gathering the items that once belonged to the girl and performing the ritual under the light of a full moon. The thought of confronting the doll once more filled Mr. Brown with both dread and determination. On the night of the full moon, the group gathered in Mr. Brown's garden, the air charged with anticipation. They had created a circle with the items they had collected, a worn-out toy, a piece of the doll's fabric, and a flower from the garden. As they began the ritual, Mr. Brown could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. He recited the incantation, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. The garden glowed under the moonlight, illuminating their faces with an ethereal glow. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the garden, swirling around them as shadows danced at the edge of their vision. Mr. Brown's heart pounded as he sensed the presence of the darkness, watching, waiting for its moment to strike. But he pressed on, fueled by the love and support of his friends. They chanted together, their voices rising into the night, intertwining with the whispers of the past. As they reached the climax of the ritual, the air crackled with energy and the shadows grew fainter. In that moment, Mr. Brown understood that love and friendship were the true keys to overcoming darkness. With a final cry, he let go of his fears, trusting that together they could break the curse that had haunted them for so long. As the last words echoed through the garden, a brilliant light enveloped them, dispelling the shadows and filling the air with warmth. The weight of the curse lifted, and Mr. Brown felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. They had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious, united in their strength and love. In the days that followed, the garden thrived more than ever before, symbolizing their resilience and newfound hope. Mr. Brown continued to nurture his connections, turning his home into a sanctuary of love and joy. The memory of the doll became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of desire and the importance of connection. And as the seasons changed, Mr. Brown knew that while the past would always be a part of him, it no longer held the power to define his future. He had discovered that true strength came from within, and that with love, friendship, and courage, they could face any darkness that might arise. And in the heart of his garden, he found peace, a sanctuary where laughter thrived, memories flourished, and love blossomed eternally. Please like the video and subscribe the channel and click on bell icon.